All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, March 28th, and you were just telling me that you have an update about the anti-Hamas protests. So, in the last episode a couple days ago, I asked you about these anti-Hamas protests that were happening in Gaza, and you were kind of skeptical about it. You said you hadn't heard anything about it, but then now you have. So, what have you learned?
Well, I haven't heard a whole lot, but when you asked me, I was completely ignorant. I hadn't heard anything. And then immediately after the podcast, I read an article in Haaretz, the Israeli leftist newspaper, about the protests. It said that there were several hundred or hundreds, so I'm not quite sure how many participated. I saw a few photos, and some of the participants were interviewed. One of them, I just remember, said that he just did it out of desperation. I mean, everything has been destroyed here. He's in North Gaza. He's just constantly, he thought finally that the war had come to an end with the ceasefire, that it hasn't, and that's what this one young man said to explain his motivation. It's certainly possible that it's legitimate. You just put yourself in their shoes and you just say, nothing's working. I don't know what to do. It's just, Hamas can't defend us. These people are just, are killing us. They're going to kill us all. What can we do? The international community is obviously unwilling to intervene. Of course, it's really because of the United States more than anything else. Maybe if we make a direct appeal, if we separate ourselves from Hamas, we might have a chance. Maybe I could, I think that it is possible that it is legitimate. But there also could be, Israelis that are, let's say, some Israeli operatives that are behind this. It's certainly possible. I just have to mention that. There wasn't any evidence of that, but it's possible because I would emphasize that I don't think it would be Netanyahu's people, because they, in fact, I believe, want Hamas to stay there and use them as an excuse for ethnic cleansing. And if Hamas was actually overthrown, it would be much harder. They would be deprived of one of their excuses for ethnic cleansing. And again, we know that Netanyahu himself was involved in building up Hamas, and I think it's because he saw that they were within, like the U.S. and in Europe, it was easier to demonize them and to justify his own actions against Gaza. And I think that, that has always been the policy of Netanyahu and his people. So it wouldn't be Netanyahu if, in fact, there is some sort of Israeli involvement or, instigation of this protest. It would be, much more likely the liberal faction that wants to continue with the ceasefire in order to bring home all the hostages. I think that's possible. And, just that, when I point that out, this division is for real within Israel society. It's very serious. I just was reading that according to the senior reservist commanders in the IDF, approximately they expect that 50% of the reservists that are being called up will not show up. And they've already heard from a lot of them. A lot of them are saying outright it's because you broke the ceasefire, and I just can't support this. We need to bring the hostages home. Others are talking about the attacks on the judiciary, the firing of the Shin Bet chief, these kind of things that we mentioned earlier. There's a lot of anger in I guess nearly half or approximately half of Israeli society against Netanyahu. Again, let's make this clear that these are Zionists. The IDF has killed all these Palestinian civilians. So we're not talking about people that are anyway really concerned about Palestine, but are concerned, are anti-Netanyahu, to the point where they're not showing up. So that actually could put a real brake on IDF operations. So, if they can't get 50% of the reservists, it's going to make it much more difficult for them to achieve their objectives.
When they call up these reservists and half of them just don't show up, what do they do? Do they throw them in jail for refusing to the call? I mean,
No. It's just they say they feel they can't do it because, first of all, a lot of these reservists already served 18 months, which was a lot more. And it just would be so much anger in Israeli society. You say, okay, these guys were already there for 18 months. They've already, they're reservists. They're people with normal jobs and, families and whatever. They had to give all that up. And now you're forcing them to go back in. So I think there's an awareness that they just can't get away with that. So that's if they don't show up, there's really not a whole lot that they can do about it at this point.
Then that number will probably grow, right? I mean, who would want to go back in unless you just love killing Palestinian civilians, you know?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. That is a real problem. I guess there are some, hardcore. There certainly are, people that are really committed to ethnic cleansing and they want to be back in there. And those are the people that they're going to get. The other ones are not so committed. They're not at least talking about it. They're not saying this is the reason I'm not going in. A number of reasons were listed, but not one of them actually had anything to do with the welfare of the Palestinians. It was all about domestic Israeli politics. And then I think just personal reasons. I'm exhausted. I have this job, I have family duties, that kind of thing.
Do you think there's a growing movement at all within Israel that is wanting to show some compassion towards the Palestinians, that want to just end this war, that believe that they need to live alongside them? Because I know if they did, because I do see some of these people on TikTok, there are Israelis there are Jews there in Israel that are speaking out. I know they're a minority, but the amount of international support they get is huge. And I feel like that can kind of be fuel to that fire to grow that movement within Israel to say like, hey, there has to be a better way than just ethnically cleansing, than this extermination campaign we're carrying out in Gaza. Do you know anything if that's growing at all?
If it's growing, it's still very, very small. There are good, brave individuals, who are saying these things. I read Haaretz regularly, and it is like the left-wing Israeli paper. It's one that historically has had, where if you're going to find any kind of compassion for Palestinians, that's where you found it. That's just the way it has been in Israel. But I'm actually struck by how few of the people ever even talk about Palestinian suffering. There are a few that are quite, who are don't pull any punches and describe the horrors and say Israel's got to stop this. Gideon Levy, he writes for them. He's one example, but the vast majority, definitely a very large majority, just seem to refuse to even consider. Like they almost think that that's sort of for whatever reason, they refuse to consider Palestinian suffering. It's just all about domestic politics, and that's it. So if, you're looking at this leftist publication, there are so few, it's a minority within a small minority within a small minority. I think we're talking about a really just individuals within the population. We're not talking about a real movement. Remember earlier, there was that poll taken of Jewish Israelis, and it found only 2% of them thought that too much had been done, too much killing, too much destruction had been done in Gaza. Only 2%.
Well, we should try to support that 2% whenever we can.
Yeah, I agree.
If you see them on Twitter or TikTok, social media, show that support, because respect to those Israelis that are speaking out against it. Maybe it can cause some type of change within Israel and end this bloodshed. But if it's just 2%, it doesn't sound good. But you were talking about how Netanyahu doesn't want to see Hamas go, that these anti-Hamas protests within Gaza are most likely from the left-wing side, people that want to bring the hostages home. Does this tie into a little bit into what I've been seeing called Qatar Gate? That I saw this headline and said that this could bring Netanyahu down, and I know it has something to do with Qatar funding Hamas, probably via Netanyahu. I didn't fully. It seemed complicated, and I said, "I'll let Dad explain this to me."
Okay.
So now
Yeah.
I'm asking you now. Explain Qatar Gate.
Okay, it is complicated. Yeah, there are a number of scandals just swirling around Netanyahu. First of all, there is an investigation ongoing about his role in the October 7th attack, by Hamas. Not, I don't think that he's being charged that he orchestrated it or anything like that, but there's just, that was, to what extent was he responsible for the lack of preparedness, the failure to see it coming. So there's that. But that's just one. And then there's also this corruption investigation that's ongoing. That was actually started, I believe, years before October 7th. And the war on Gaza actually resulted in a temporary, cessation of that investigation. It started up again actually during the ceasefire, and it turned out that it was actually on the day that the day after, I think he launched the renewed attack on Gaza, the end of the ceasefire. He was supposed to appear in court, but he was able to request a cancellation of that hearing, on security or national security grounds, and the judge granted it to him. So, again, I think you can see that it's very much in his own personal interest, right, to be carrying out this attack. But more than that, there's Qatar Gate. And Qatar Gate is, it's quite complicated. Actually, it started off, I think it was an investigation a few months ago into some leaks of classified information from Netanyahu's staff. Some of his close aides apparently leaked some classified information. And when I guess it was the Shin Bet that was looking into it, found out that, they discovered something else was going on, that some of these staff members, some of these advisors to Netanyahu had received payments from Qatar, the Gulf Coast state, that actually has been quite important as a place where mediation or negotiations have taken place between Israel and Hamas. Now, I don't know if they're sure about what all these payments were for, but the ones that they, where they could get to the bottom of it, this is what they found out, that Qatar was paying these Netanyahu aides to kind of act as lobbyists for them. It actually goes back before October 7th. There was there were soccer championships, football championships were held in Qatar some years ago. And so they were hired actually sort of like PR guys to improve their image. And then these payments continued after October 7th, and they were similar. It was like PR, improving the image of Qatar, emphasizing how Qatar is such an important place, the ideal site for negotiations, for example, rather than Egypt. They actually, so these guys were paid off to make that argument to the public, and I think they did so effectively. But there were other payments, and the interesting thing, was one key issue is the negotiations themselves. The negotiations, as I understand it, were held by Ronan Bar, the head of Shin Bet, which is, again, the Israeli FBI. But while he was leading these negotiations, however sincere or insincere they may have been, these other guys were, actually making their own contacts and kind of subverting the negotiations, the ones that had been actually paid by Qatar,
which are Netanyahu's aides.
Yeah,
you're
Netanyahu's aides. So it's not clear exactly, what's going on here, but it's clearly, illegal. And, again, it's like, if these were just private citizens, sure, they could hire themselves out as PR guys, but these were government aides, and they were using their government connections, right, to make these deals with individuals in Qatar, I guess members of the Qatari government. So anyway, this has led to a great deal of outrage, and there's a lot of anger on the part of the Shin Bet chief, Ronan Bar, So what did Netanyahu do? He fired him, or at least attempted to. I believe the attorney general said that, oh, you can't do that, but now Netanyahu says he's going to fire the attorney general. So you see, there is a real serious internal, or let's say, domestic conflict in Israel. There's this fight between Netanyahu and his government, his coalition, and Shin Bet, and to lesser. He's had more success, I think, in taking over the IDF. He has his own defense minister and his own commander in chief. I don't know exactly what the title is. And now he wants to take over. Get people that are loyal to him within Shin Bet and also the Attorney General's office. And that's the fight he's fighting right now. But there's resistance.
Okay, well, you did a lot of explaining, but I feel just as confused.
Well, it is confusing. I agree. It's not quite clearly. Okay, it seems like partly these people, you can say on one level, is just corruption, right? These are people that are using their government connections, to make money as essentially, PR agents. That's corruption. But then it's potentially more serious, if they really were undermining the negotiations and for what reason, again, it's been clear. I don't think it's clear. I'm certain that Netanyahu for the longest time did not want to have any ceasefire, did not want to have successful negotiations. We got this temporary ceasefire, and it was clear from the start that he wanted to sabotage it, and he has. But was he aware? That's another question. Was Netanyahu aware of what these guys were doing? There's a strong suspicion that he was, but there isn't any proof of it yet.
I'm confused, though. Why would the Qataris be paying Netanyahu's aides to subvert the negotiations?
Okay, well, I can certainly understand why, where they're talking about Qatar's image. Again, that's clear cut. Now, what's happening in regard to the negotiations, I'm not sure. It's pretty murky. I don't know if anybody other than the direct participants really knows right now.
You'd think it would be Israel paying Qatar to sabotage the negotiations, right?
Yeah, I know. I don't understand. That's right. I mean, I think it's so. There's something fishy, rotten, but it's not. Again, it's an ongoing investigation. Not everything has been, not all the facts have been determined yet.
Yeah, I saw a headline saying that this could bring down Netanyahu. Do you believe that's possible? Can this guy be brought down? It seems like he has an infinite number of lives.
Yeah, I think he's actually exhausted his 9 lives a while ago. Yeah, well, it's interesting. There is a chance of it, but that that gives them all the more incentive, of course, to go ahead and pursue war and to expand the war. The more of a war there is, and even to invite serious retaliation from Iran, for example, because there is this natural tendency, of course, to rally around the flag in any country, and certainly in Israel. And he knows that, and he can give this national security excuse to keep them, to shut down these investigations. And he's already done that in the case of the corruption trial. So this is the scary thing, he's always wanted to attack Iran, but I think his motivation has greatly increased now that his let's say his career, but maybe even his freedom. He could end up in jail. These things are on the line, and his only way out, possibly, is through war.
Well, it's a dangerous man in a dangerous situation. So, I mean, do you think that really what we're seeing in Gaza, a big reason that it's been going on for so long is because of these corruption charges and now this Qatar Gate scandal as well, all these scandals surrounding him? So he's just like, I'll just keep on going because the longer I go, they can't touch me?
I'm sure it figures in. It's part of it. But it's more than that. I think, he's an extreme Zionist, and he has a coalition that's made of even more extreme Zionists. Again, Ben Gvir was brought back into the coalition as soon as he attacked. That was Ben Gvir's condition. I'm out of here, no ceasefire. When the ceasefire ended, Ben Gvir came back in, and so his own coalition was strengthened. So it's about the coalition. It's about his own vision. I think he wants to ethnically cleanse Gaza. There's no question about it. But there's, on top of that, there's his own personal survival and freedom. It all, converges and creates, a huge, just an overwhelming motivation to pursue the path of war.
Yeah, dark. Do you think, just going back to Qatar Gate, can Qatar credibly perform the role as a mediator now, or is it thrown into question?
Well, I think it should. If there was, if corruption has been exposed, we may just be seeing the tip of the iceberg, and quite possibly, payments were going both ways. Yeah, I think you're right. There's just maybe those just haven't been identified yet. Again, this investigation is in its kind of initial stage. It should call into question. Now, actually, Qatar, it should be pointed out, has had connections with Hamas, and has funded Hamas. I mean, that was well known. It's not something that was hidden. But then so did Netanyahu. That's the incredible thing.
Right? Netanyahu fund them through Qatar? Or...
I can't remember the details, but that's probably how it was done. Yeah, I think.
Oh, the whole thing. So a web of lies and deceit, I don't know what's going on. But I was definitely a little bit skeptical about Qatar's role in negotiations after that Steve Witkoff interview with Tucker Carlson.
Oh, yeah, he kept on praising them.
Kept on praising him so much, but then said he never actually spoke to Hamas. But yeah, Qatar's handling it all, so we know what Hamas is like. We never actually talked to them ourselves. I've never talked to those guys, but Qatar's telling us what's going on. It's like, well, isn't that a problem? If you don't actually... If you're the one that's supposed to be this envoy, but you don't actually deal with Hamas in any capacity, you do it through a third party. It made me a little suspicious. So, well, I'm still confused, but I think everybody is.
I am too.
So.
I think we're all confused. I think the Israelis are confused too. They're looking at it, but they just know something's wrong. And then also, I think it should be pointed out that there does appear to be a split within Hamas. I mean, there's... there are these people who are members of Hamas but actually don't live in Gaza, and they are actually the ones who conduct the negotiations in places like Qatar, and they may have been corrupted. It may be actually a very kind of cozy relationship. This is something that happens. So recently, they've been in favor of of extending the first phase in violation, it must be said, of the original agreement. Again, there were supposed to be 3 phases, and we're supposed to go on to the second phase. In fact, Israel did not keep its part of, failed to perform a lot of the things that it had promised in the first phase. But even so, the Hamas was willing to continue. He said, we agreed to go to the second phase, and we know what's supposed to happen here. But okay, it was torpedoed by Netanyahu. He just wanted to get out of the ceasefire. But Hamas was willing to actually negotiate with Netanyahu just to extend the first phase. And we're talking about Hamas in Qatar, but Hamas on the ground in Gaza. We're talking about the actual, military commanders that are fighting the Israelis there. They said, no, we're sticking with the original agreement. So that's an added layer. Yeah. Which is, I find in a way it's not that surprising. Again, Hamas has been remarkably unified and brave. They're facing an opponent that's 1,000 times more powerful than themselves. It's kind of, like the Houthis in Yemen. And, but they are a small organization against a very powerful enemy that has basically, a bottomless pocket, and there's always the potential for corruption, especially outside of Gaza.
Okay, well, we'll see how it plays out. A lot of intrigue here. Something I was just thinking about that last night was about the Samson option. We've all heard of the Samson option, but I would like you to explain it again. And does Israel really have the ability to take a big part of the world down with it? And do you think that that's really a real concern for the world that we need to think about?
Well, I think it is a real concern. I they have missiles that I can't remember the names of them right now, but
The Jericho,
the
Jericho
Jericho,
2,
I guess
1
it
and
is.
2.
Yeah, that can go thousands of kilometers. It can't. It's not intercontinental. It can't travel to North America or to East Asia. So we're not talking about the whole world. But could I believe, if I remember correctly, probably hit virtually every capital in Europe, including Moscow. And they have at least, according to every estimate that I've heard, at least 200 nuclear warheads, and maybe 500. So they could do a great deal of damage. Now, I don't know how effective the Jericho or any other missile they may have. The Russians in particular might be, can be fairly confident that they would be able to shoot something down like that. But there's always, even with the best air defense system, there's always a risk that something goes through. And if you fire hundreds of missiles, definitely, a number of them will get through. And if they're carrying nuclear warheads, they can just do catastrophic damage. So yeah, the Samson option is a real threat and something, things really, if they start to lose a war, that's something that everybody's going to be thinking about. That's a real problem.
Is it a real plan that they have? Is it a real part of their doctrine, the Samson option? Yeah, like, how real is it? And we talk about it because it's terrifying, but...
Right. Well, it's, I haven't actually heard any discussion of it recently, but it's something that people were aware of decades ago. I think it's just like the Israelis leaked it. That's the point, is they want people to believe in it, that they have this, let's say, final plan, or and I think it's possible. I mean, just look at the psychology of the current Israeli government. I think it's if there's no Israel, then there's if we're going down, you're all going down. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that in fact is what they would do.
Just the fact that they've leaked it and everybody is aware that there's something called a Samson option that exists.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Why isn't anybody doing anything about it? There's all these cries. Iran, you got a civilian nuclear program. You have to stop it immediately. Nobody can have it. But everybody knows that Israel has it. And on top of that, they have something that everybody knows called the Samson option.
Yeah.
Why does nobody speak up?
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing. It's just that Israel's always the exception.
Like Russia, China, the European countries, you're the ones that are on the target list for the Samson option. Don't you care?
Well, the Europeans are gluttons for punishment. It's just, these are, I don't think we can expect any, rational statements from European governments, not for a long time, I'm afraid. I don't know if the Russians, it's a tough one. I don't know what you say. Well, again, I think the Chinese are out of range. I may be wrong, but I think they are. The Russians, I don't know if they've said anything, but it's just, what's the purpose right now? It's, there is this glaring hypocrisy and that we find in regard to Israel, right? All this focus on Iran, as you say, but Israel clearly has long been in violation of the non-proliferation treaty.
It truly is a rogue state, right? Yeah. It doesn't have to follow the rules, and the only reason it doesn't have to follow the rules is because of America.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's true. I think it would cease to be a rogue state, not overnight, but the only way to cause it to cease to be a rogue state would be to withdraw support, for the Americans to withdraw support. And, the days of being a rogue state would be over. They'd start to realize, oh, wait a second, we're only, 7 million Jews, and, we have with a relatively, sophisticated but a tiny economy. And we have infuriated all of our neighbors, and hey, boy, maybe we should pursue a different course right now, because if there is a general war, we're going to lose it.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, it really is the fault of the United States because we enabled this.
Yeah.
If we stopped, let's say, at 1967, when the 1967 lines were drawn, then and we just said, okay, you have to figure this out on your own. We're not going to back you to the hill every single time. Yeah. Then they would have had to make peace with their neighbors. They would have figured out how to integrate into that society. But the fact that we didn't just allowed this increasingly, extremist Greater Israel nationalist movement expand. Because I saw something that, what we're seeing now in Israel, it didn't exist 30, 40 years ago to the level it is now. It was more of a fringe element.
Right. It was on the margins, right.
Right. And now it's become completely mainstream, this idea that, we're going to take it all. And that would never have happened, I think, if the U.S. just said, okay, yeah, you guys, all right, you won the 1967 war, with our help, but that's it, nothing, you're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah. 1967 was an important watershed. Not only did the U.S. fail, of course, I think we voted for a UN resolution that demanded a two-state solution and for Israel to withdraw, but we never backed it up. That's been our official position, I think, even to this day, but it's turned into a joke because we just never backed it up. We know what's been happening in the West Bank. But it was also 1967 was when the USS Liberty was attacked, and we knew who attacked them, and we knew that it was deliberate. It was the Israelis, and they killed, I believe it was 37 men aboard that ship, and nearly sunk it. It's only through heroic action on the part of some of that crew that the ship was not sunk. It could have, all 300 or 300, 400 members, or crew members on that ship could have gone down to the bottom of the sea, killed deliberately by Israel. We knew it, but we decided to cover up for them. And I think that was sort of that was a watershed moment. It was at that point that we just became unconditional supporters of Israel and complicit in everything they did, up to and including attacks on ourselves.
Right, and at that moment, I guess Israel knew that they could get away with literal murder of Americans, and just to serve their interests. That's a wild story. It's a wild situation that we have here that we allow to happen. But we're really living in this seismic event where it's all changing because the source of Israel's power is the United States, and the U.S. power is waning, and it's waning rapidly. For the longest time, America could just get away with anything. Nobody dared stand up to America until really what I think changed things was the Ukraine-Russia war. That happened, and then all of a sudden we realized that, we are not all powerful. We can't just dictate whatever we want in the world, and people just have to go along with it. But the thing that's scary is that's our whole sort of sense of being as a nation, in some way as a nation, is this overwhelming military force, and nobody questions our authority. We do it. Russia's now questioned it, and then our idea to respond to that, I feel like, is no, we have to reassert that power projection, reassert our military dominance, but it's failing. We're seeing it. We pumped everything into Ukraine. We Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea with the Houthis. All of a sudden, even these little nations now have the ability to strike back. We always say we're going to use overwhelming force, but now all of a sudden, it's like people stood up and say, "Hey, you're not as tough and bad as we thought you were," and we can strike back, and that's a scary moment. It's like, and I feel like that's the game we're playing right now with Iran. Is we were saying, with Trump's overwhelming force ultimatum, you have 2 months, overwhelming force, back, can we back it up? I don't think we can. Mm-hmm. And then the thing is, Iran can strike back. All these other countries can stand up, and everybody hates us for this, mm-hmm. and rightly so. I do too. And so when that happens, I don't know. Can you just sort of expound on this train of thought that's coming out? Like you take it from here, Dad. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, sure. Well, I guess first of all, I wanted to say it's not always been that way. that, that we've had the sense that, we don't need to negotiate. We simply punish, disobedient countries as we please. It goes back to the 1990s, to the
as long as I've been alive. So.
Okay, yeah, right, yeah, basically. But before that, during the Cold War years, we had to take into account the power of the Soviet Union, and that meant that we had to proceed cautiously. And but that all ended, of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union. So it really, this mentality, I guess it was always there, but it blossomed, you could say, during the 1990s, this American exceptionalism, which was always there. It just became, was fully realized. And we've seen the consequences in a lot of disastrous wars. And maybe we hope that we're starting to see the end of it, that there is a growing realism. Clearly, we've heard, really very direct statements, again, it's in particular by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's pretty much said just what I was saying. And that's very encouraging. And, we do see some signs that there is an awakening. It may not, there's the fear that it's just this administration, which may end up failing, maybe on the domestic fronts, on the economic front, and will be replaced by the Democrats in 4 years. But I think there's still reason to be very cautiously optimistic that this increasing realism, will continue, or because I don't think it's just the administration. I don't think that actually Trump could get away with as much as he had if there wasn't some support, within the deep state. We've talked about it earlier, that there is this realist faction, again, especially in the Pentagon, like when it comes to Russia. So he did have, it wasn't that he had the entire deep state arrayed against him. Certainly much of it, I think most of it is very hostile to what he's trying to do in Russia. But there is, we noticed it earlier, that it was often like the real resistance to Biden's moves, his escalatory moves actually came from the Pentagon. So I think that there is something there. And it may be just that, and recently they've come out with statements. I think, it was the annual National Threat Assessment. And it basically, it didn't just basically, it acknowledged that the Russians were going to win the war in Ukraine. It said that even regardless of how much weaponry we pump in there or how much intelligence we provide, they're going to win the war. There's nothing we can do to change that trajectory. And again, this is all the intelligence communities. Okay, yeah, we do have Tulsi Gabbard there as DNI. But, maybe some of these changes, there are realists in there. And the fact is, like, the reality becomes harder and harder to deny every year. So even if 4 years from now the Democrats take over, it may be that we will see a slightly humbler, more realistic policy than what we had before. I think there's a reason to be hopeful about that. Again, the great exception, though, to everything is Israel.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, sure, yeah, I understand on the Ukraine-Russia front, we're seeing, and when we talk about multipolarity, it's within regards to Russia and China. But when it comes to the Middle East, Israel dictates our foreign policy. They see, I keep on wondering how could it be that the Israel lobby is so powerful, but it clearly is. It clearly does just have a firm grip, on that steering wheel.
Yeah, so it does. And then again, there are people, even if the Israeli lobby, ended it, let's say it's all its activities, its financial support tomorrow, I don't think, we would still have a very powerful pro-Israel contingent. It would take a long time for that to change. Because some of it, again, does come out of Christian Zionism and it's quite important. It's not just about money. I think a lot of people are just ideologically convinced. The money, of course, strengthens it, expands it, sustains it. But But even if you cut off, just ended that flow of money, it's going to be here. It's a part of America now. I mean, it's something. It's a real force, that has roots here in this country.
Well, Zionism will have to collapse eventually, right? I mean, it can't go forever, right?
No.
And do you feel like we're coming to that point? Like we said, the only way that Israel's able to do what it's doing is because of the back of the United States and the U.S. and the unipolar moment, just really let them do whatever they want. But all of a sudden, we're in the situation where we realize we can't. Right? And then that means that Israel can't do whatever it wants if the U.S. can't do whatever it wants, right? I mean, the Houthis are slowing things down. They're the only ones that are standing up right now, but at some point, somebody else is going to stand up. And as more people stand up, then it's over, right?
Well, not necessarily. It's just that within, really the one country that would be capable of standing up or is capable of standing up to Israel is Iran. And it's clear, you just actually recently, we just mentioned this ultimatum that was delivered to Iran by Trump. They have responded and they have firmly rejected it. We're not going along with this. No, we're not going to accept your ultimatums. We're not negotiating with you, until we have some signs that you're actually are negotiating in good faith, that you are no longer seeking our destruction. We are a sovereign nation and we're not going to bow down to you. That's basically what it said. So, we may be on the course for war. And as we said, again, the Houthis are brave and they can, interdict this commercial shipping. They've proven they can do that. But I don't think they can really inflict serious harm on the U.S. Navy. Now, again, I may be wrong. Maybe a missile will get through, and it will. But and occasionally a missile does get through to, let's say, Tel Aviv and does some damage, but it's nothing serious. It really isn't. It doesn't. It's not going to change the calculations of the Israeli leadership. But Iran can do that serious damage, as we said before. And that's the one nation that really can resist. But yeah, what would happen? I don't know. We've talked about it. What if Iran does strike, all the U.S. military bases in the region, causes hundreds, thousands of casualties? What if it sinks a U.S. naval vessel? I'm afraid, that it was just, it's not just under Trump, but any U.S. leader would escalate and maybe even go to nuclear weapons. I mean, it's a very scary situation. Just looking at the situation now, I don't know. It just looks really bad. I don't see a solution. Yeah, I agree that in the long run, that Israel is on the course to self-destruction. It's just the kind of people that have taken over they're not rational. And I think eventually they're going to invite their own destruction. I think they put Israel on that course, but they still have a very powerful force, and that is the U.S. behind them. It's not going to be there forever, I agree, but it's there for the foreseeable future.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you say that Iran's the only power in the region that can inflict some damage, real damage, and stand up. But that's maybe right now. But what we've seen with the Houthis is, 8 years ago, people were saying they were bombed back to the Stone Age, and now look what they're doing. It's just a matter of time before they have the capability to sink one of our ships. Do something like this. I think so. I mean, we see we've talked about just the drone warfare in Ukraine and how it's this technological battle going on there, and just the advancements that are being made so quickly. When you're in this situation where, it's a life or death kind of matter for you, when you're engaged in this type of conflict like this, that's where you see true innovation come out. Like nothing, necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing coming out of the Houthis. So, maybe not now, but in a year, 2 years, and if they're able to get some help from the Iranians and some tech, I wouldn't be too surprised if they have the capability to sink a U.S. naval vessel or strike the Diego Garcia base, something like this, and who knows? I mean, they're sending pretty impressive missiles all the way to Tel Aviv.
Yeah, no, I'm rather astounded by what they've done so far. So, I wouldn't firmly, confidently say that they can't do more. Certainly they might be able to. They may very well do so.
Yeah, they're the world's greatest underdogs right now.
Yeah.
They seem to be the only part of the acts of resistance that is active. Do we know what has happened to the rest? Is Hezbollah essentially, out of commission?
Hezbollah was very seriously damaged, I think in particular by the strikes on its leadership. I think, again, the soldiers in southern Lebanon performed valiantly and effectively against the Israelis. But Israel has not honored the ceasefire that was agreed to. They've held on to territory that they promised they would withdraw from. And they're now escalating again. I think for the first time since the ceasefire was put in place, they launched a major attack on Beirut just today. I don't know how much damage they did, but it was extensive. I've just seen some of the photos. Hezbollah is reeling, and it's, as I said earlier, its domestic situation has deteriorated. It's still there, but it's suffered some real setbacks, and probably the greatest setback again is the fall of the Assad government, and that means the loss of their supply line. There's still ways to supply them, but it's just going to be harder. There's just no question about it. And I think there's also evidence that the security breach that led to all those attacks, it was clear that the Israelis knew where Hezbollah leaders were. It seems like virtually every minute of the day that security breach or breaches, they have not been completely plugged yet, because I think they're still striking Hezbollah leaders. So they've got to figure that out. There was clearly some sort of very extensive, thorough penetration of the Hezbollah organization by Israeli operatives. One of the problems, of course, is that in Lebanon, Lebanon is a very fragmented society. It's not unified like
the Houthis.
like the Palestinians like the Houthis or the Palestinians in Gaza. The small demonstration notwithstanding, and that in general Gaza is very unified. But Lebanon is a multi-confessional society that's deeply penetrated by the West and therefore by Israel. Like the U.S. has a huge embassy. I think it may be one of its largest embassies in the world, if not the largest, in Lebanon. Why? Because it's really a base for intelligence operations. And the Lebanese army is basically in the pay of the Americans. So that's the environment that Hezbollah operates in. So it is it's much more difficult to maintain security in an environment like that. And over time, it's clear that the Israelis, almost certainly with extensive Western help, managed to penetrate Hezbollah, and that is still an ongoing problem. So Hezbollah has been weakened. They're still there, but they're definitely weakened. And Iran is holding off for now. It's clearly they don't want to wage a war, but neither are they showing any signs that they're going to bend the knee. And so they may end up with a war, and it sounds like that from the Ayatollah Khamenei's recent statement that they understand that. And if the U.S. is going to, and Israel are going to bring war to Iran, Iran will fight that war.
Okay. Oh, all right. Well, let's move over to Russia-Ukraine a little bit, just to wrap things up. The Middle East has really been occupying most of my time ever since things started flaring up. I'm just watching it. It's just been hard to see what's happening in Gaza. But I know what's happening in Russia-Ukraine. This is a monumental event. Russia is really breaking the unipolar moment. Has broken it.
Yeah.
So can you give us any updates first, maybe just on the Russia-Ukraine front?
They have taken back actually almost all of Kursk. There was a sliver of land. It was actually two small pockets right on the Sumy-Kursk border there. And they have those two small pockets, they've completely retaken one of them. They've gone all the way to the border and beyond. Now, actually, they now have more Sumy land than Ukraine has Kursk land. So they have, while taking back those last slivers of land in Kursk, they have been advancing within Sumy, not particularly rapidly, but steadily. So, yeah, that it's clear. I think it's going to be probably the matter of the next few days that the Ukrainians will be forced to retreat from that last very small pocket in Kursk. They just can't hold it. I mean, the Russians are advancing within Sumy on the flanks. And then, just about everywhere else, particularly, again, in the Kharkov region around Kupiansk and then Liman. Okay, these are both important cities in the Kharkov region. Let's see, Liman, I'm not sure, maybe. No, it is in Kharkov. Yeah, they have continued to advance and actually have made very large advances. I mean, in the last couple of months, and they have continued those. It doesn't draw much attention, but it's very significant. And then we see something similar going on in South Donetsk and also Zaporozhye. So South Donetsk, the south of Pokrovsk. There's not a whole lot going on there, but the Russians have taken back all the territory that Ukraine took in a counterattack or a series of counterattacks a couple of weeks ago. So that's all been erased, and they are starting to advance again. But farther south, they've been advancing more steadily. I think down there, farther south in Donetsk, you find they have gone, completely past the fortified area, and they're entering into that that part
open
of
fields.
Yeah, the open fields, the steppe. Again, the less populated area where it's going to be very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to resist advances. And that's what we're seeing already. They're moving very steadily. Maybe you wouldn't quite say rapidly, but just kilometers a day in some of those areas down there. So that's what we see. And then there's still talk about possibility of major offensives, but we just never know. We always hear about this. They could do it. The Russians have the reserves. They have them up in the north, and they have them in the Zaporozhye region. So those are the two places where most people are looking. But, it may be misdirection if the big push may come in Kharkov. We're already seeing a lot of advances, very significant advances.
Okay, and what are we seeing coming out of the Western leadership? Are the Europeans, are they still in full-blown panic, running around with their heads cut off, not knowing any direction?
Yeah, there's no sign of any kind of adjustment in European policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. They're doubling down on everything. No end to the sanctions. There's a talk about the maybe renewing the grain deal in the Black Sea. But for that to go forward, the Europeans would actually have to agree to it. That's at least what the Europeans are saying, because SWIFT is, in fact, headquartered in Brussels. And that's one thing that the Russians have demanded is that, you got to reconnect SWIFT to our agricultural bank if we're going to have this grain deal. And they're refusing to do that. And they're still talking, Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, they're still talking about sending their troops to Ukraine. And even I think it was Macron that recently made a statement, probably Karmer too. It's just like, it doesn't matter what the Russians think. So we're going to do this. It's not clear exactly under what circumstances they're going to do it, but they're still talking big, in spite of the fact that the military, in the case of Britain anyway, has said that this is all nonsense. We don't have the ability to do this. But these guys, they just live in this fantasy world, and they don't show any signs of actually, finally returning to reality. We're not seeing any signs of that within Europe. It was certainly not, in France or England. or the UK. Again, there are countries that have actually made it clear that they do not want to take part in any sort of peacekeeping, so-called mission in Ukraine. Italy, Spain, Germany. We'll see what happens now that we have the new chancellor in Germany. He's much more hawkish. The other one, of course, Schultz was actually very hawkish, but Merz, if anything, is even more hawkish. So we'll see what
Schultz
happens.
didn't have a spine. He was kind of a spineless hawk, so it was kind
right. But he did actually show a spine in a way when it came to, for example, the Taurus missiles. He caved in on everything. And I remember it was just like, okay, then you saw one thing after another. He said, oh, no, we can't do this. And then he would do it. And so then it happened with regard to the Taurus missiles, I think about like 2 years ago. And he said, no, we can't do this. And everybody was laughing at him. Oh, you know what he's going to do. Like next month, he said, okay. But he actually held the line there. We'll see, though, because Merz said that he wasn't. And that was part of his campaign promise. Of course, he's already broken a number of campaign promises. So who knows what Merz will do. Maybe when he gets into a good talk with his own military men. But we know that some of those generals are in favor of it because we had that leaked conversation. I think they would like to have send Taurus missiles to Ukraine, which would be a major escalation.
With all this delusion coming out of Western leaders, just seem to be just grips of insanity almost.
Yeah.
Including the U.S. in what we're doing. Is this all just symptoms of end of the empire? Was that really what we're kind of seeing? Is this just kind of a general just effect that the empire is collapsing, and that's what we're witnessing? And
right. Yeah, I think it's impossible to explain fully. I think, as I've said many times, that irrationality cannot really be explained entirely in rational terms. But we can look at some causes. And I think one of them, perhaps the main thing, is the effects of the unipolar moment. The sense of being, the unchallenged leader of the world, morally, militarily, economically, in all these spheres. It's very hard for some people to let go of that. I think maybe that just that makes people crazy, drunk on their own power or sense of virtue. And when it's threatened, they can't say that they don't, unfortunately, they don't accept the reality. They don't choose the path of humility and say, okay, yeah, maybe we overdid it, whatever. They double down. They tend to lash out. They tend to, at least that's what we're seeing in Europe and in much of the US. They grasp that fantasy, that sense of, again, of exceptionalism. They just grasp that even more firmly.
Yeah, all three of those pillars you mentioned, superior economy, military, and morality, they're all gone. And that's the reality, is that we are not the moral superpower. Yeah. We're not the military superpower, and we're no longer the economic superpower. Yeah.
I think that's especially true of the morality. It was never, we did always claim this moral superiority. But maybe, there was some basis to it back in the Cold War. There really was. It was exaggerated, and, there were ugly, there's kind of had an ugly underbelly. But it was, it wasn't all fantasy. There was a reality to it. We were, in a sense, the free world. But that's just not true anymore. I mean, it's just like, especially, I'm just looking at these recent events, the complicity in the genocide in Gaza, the full-throated support for Banderites in Ukraine, and recently the support. Let's be honest, there's actual real support. Germany and Canada, they've announced aid packages to al-Jawani, the Al-Qaeda man that is leading Syria now. And they did so immediately after the massacres of civilians in the West, the horrible, horrible massacres. I mean, the morality is, I guess the West is good at hiding its own hypocrisy from itself, but the rest of the world can see it. It's just glaringly obvious.
Yeah. Makes me ashamed to be part of the West. It's making me root for the empire collapse, but I don't know if I should because I live in the empire.
Yeah, no. Right. We can only hope for some sort of peaceful solution. Like maybe within the United States, peaceful secessions, and maybe a breakup of the EU, and that peacefully, we hope so, but it's just, it's rare that such things happen. They've happened in the past. Of course, there is a case of Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, a very peaceful, amicable divorce. It can be done. I'm just looking at one thing. Secession is just part of it, but that would be part, I think, of abandoning the hegemonic mindset. It's like, hey, we no longer insist on ruling the world, and we no longer insist on maintaining our control on every country within our own part of the world. We're abandoning this mindset, and I think if we could, part of that would be peaceful secession. That's what I can hope for, but I just don't see a whole lot of rationality again, or any sort of these people remain wedded to the hegemonic vision. Certainly in Europe, we find that there's a retreat from it. In the U.S., clearly there is a growing realism, but it is not happening in, let's say, a very smooth and confidence-inspiring fashion. There are a lot of obstacles, just with regard to Russia and Ukraine, but we're not seeing it all. Of course, in the Middle East, there is a refusal to acknowledge the realities and to abandon the hegemonic mindset over there.
Ooh, interesting times. You can't say it's not boring during these times. It's scary times, but we talk a lot about the military and the morality aspects of the U.S. empire, but something we don't really dive into that I think we won't have to do today is just the economic aspect of it. That could be something that actually brings down the empire before the morality part is destroying our reputation on the global stage. Our military might is being questioned around the world now after what we've seen in Ukraine and in the Red Sea. But also, I just was reading, we're about to hit $37 trillion in debt. I just felt like we did talk about the economy. We've been doing this podcast for about a year. I remember we were talking about it, and it was just like getting ready to hit 35 when we were first starting. It was like, what happened? It just fell asleep, and it's at 37 trillion now.
Right.
So something's going to break there too. So that's something maybe we can talk about. And I know Europe is not in a great situation economically either. So there's all these forces. It's inevitable now. The collapse is coming. The collapse is not coming. It's happening. We're watching it.
Yeah.
It's just which way is it going to turn as it's collapsing, and let's hope we don't blow up the world in the process.
Right.
Okay.
Agreed.
Well, we can end on that happy note then. All right,
Okay.
Dad. Have a good day and a great weekend.
Yeah. Same to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.